A change in Daniel. It was early morning, and the world was still dark as Janelle quietly stepped out of bed. She had become accustomed to these pre-dawn wake-ups, balancing two jobs to make ends meet for her and Daniel. As she moved through her small apartment, she couldn't help but feel a pang of pride every time she passed by a photograph of Daniel, his face beaming with joy and mischief. He was her everything, her reason for pushing through the long hours and sleepless nights. She packed his lunch with care, as she always did, carefully arranging his favorite peanut butter and jelly sandwich, an apple, and a small treat. She knew how much he loved surprises, and she'd always tucked in a small note for him, a habit she'd picked up to remind him he was loved, even when she couldn't be there. But as she set his lunchbox by the door, Janelle couldn't ignore the strange heaviness that had settled in her heart. In recent weeks, she'd seen subtle but unmistakable changes in Daniel. He had always been a bundle of energy and curiosity, bursting through the door after school, full of stories about his day. But lately he had grown unusually quiet, retreating into himself in a way that didn't feel right for a child so young. This morning, she planned to finally talk to him about it. She opened his bedroom door and peeked inside, her heart warming at the sight of his small frame bundled under the blankets. "Daniel," she whispered, gently shaking his shoulder. He stirred, his eyes fluttering open, looking at her with a sleepy, hesitant smile. "Good morning, sweetheart," she said, trying to sound cheerful. But as he slowly sat up, she saw that familiar shadow flicker in his eyes, the one that had been haunting her every time she looked at him lately. "Ready for school?" He nodded, but his movements were slow, reluctant. Janelle noticed the way he stared down at his hands, fidgeting nervously. She reached out, tilting his chin up to meet her gaze. "Hey, what's going on, baby?" she asked softly. "You've been so quiet lately. Is everything okay at school?" Daniel's eyes shifted away from her, and he shrugged, his small shoulders drooping. "It's just different now," he mumbled, his voice barely a whisper. Janelle frowned. "Different? What do you mean, honey?" He hesitated, glancing toward the door as if he were afraid someone might overhear. I don't like school anymore," he said finally, his voice breaking slightly. "Miss Franklin, she doesn't like me." Hearing these words, Janelle felt a chill run down her spine. Her mind raced with questions, but she kept her voice calm. "What makes you think that, Daniel? Did something happen?" He shifted uncomfortably, avoiding her gaze. "She's always mad at me. She makes me sit by myself a lot. Says I'm too loud, or that I talk too much." His little voice wavered as he spoke, and Janelle could see tears glistening in his eyes. "But I try to be good, Mama. I really do." Janelle's heart ached as she listened to her son. Daniel was the kind of kid who had a natural love for learning, the kind of boy who saw wonder in the simplest things. To think that he was being made to feel small, that he was losing his spark because of someone who was supposed to encourage and nurture him, made her blood boil. She pulled him close, wrapping him in a tight hug. "Oh, sweetheart, I know you do. You're a wonderful boy. You don't ever have to change who you are for anyone." She held him for a moment longer, feeling his little hands cling to her shirt. In that moment, Janelle made a decision. She had to find out what was going on. Daniel deserved better, and she was going to make sure he got it. Later that day, as she dropped him off at school, Janelle felt a wave of determination wash over her. She watched him walk slowly into the building, his shoulders hunched, a far cry from the vibrant boy he used to be. Something was wrong here, and she wasn't going to let it slide. She headed to work, her mind racing with questions and possibilities. Miss Franklin had always seemed polite during the brief parent-teacher interactions they'd had, but Janelle knew all too well that appearances could be deceiving. She spent the rest of her day going over every interaction she'd had with Daniel's teacher, trying to piece together a picture of what might be happening behind the closed doors of that classroom. By the time she finished her shift, she had already made up her mind to visit the school the next day during lunch. She wanted to see for herself what Daniel's days were really like. If Miss Franklin was truly mistreating her son, then Janelle would make sure she understood exactly who she was dealing with. That night, as she tucked Daniel into bed, she leaned down and kissed his forehead. "Tomorrow, I'm coming to visit you during lunch," she whispered. "Would you like that?" Daniel's face lit up for a brief moment, his eyes sparkling with a hint of the joy she remembered. "Really? You're coming to school?" he asked, his voice filled with a tentative hope. She nodded, smiling. "Yes, baby. I want to see you, and I want to make sure you're happy." He smiled back, a small but genuine smile, and in that moment, Janelle felt a fierce protectiveness swell within her. Whatever was happening, she was going to put a stop to it. No one was going to hurt her son, not while she was around. As she left his room, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. Tomorrow, she would uncover the truth, and if Miss Franklin was as cruel as Daniel's quiet words suggested, then Janelle would make sure that this teacher understood what it meant to face a mother's wrath. A mother's determination. The next morning, Janelle found herself standing in front of Daniel's elementary school, her heart pounding in her chest. She had taken an extended lunch break from work, telling her supervisor she had a personal matter to attend to. As she looked up at the building, she felt a familiar mix of anger and apprehension wash over her. Today, she was going to see exactly what her son was facing in this place where he was supposed to feel safe. After signing in at the front desk, she followed the faint sound of children's laughter down the hallway, the distant murmur of the lunchroom growing louder with every step. Janelle's pulse quickened, her fingers clenching and unclenching at her sides as she mentally prepared herself for whatever she was about to find. She pushed open the heavy double doors to the cafeteria, greeted by the bustling sight of children crowded around tables, laughing and chatting with their friends. Her eyes scanned the room, her heart sinking when she didn't immediately see Daniel's familiar mop of curls. But then, off to the side, near the back of the lunchroom, she saw him. There, at a solitary table, Daniel sat, surrounded by a large cardboard cubicle. The makeshift walls were tall enough to isolate him from the other kids, completely shutting him off from any interaction. Janelle's breath caught in her throat as she took in the sight, her stomach twisting with a mixture of shock and horror. Her little boy sat hunched over his lunch tray, his eyes downcast, shoulders slumped in defeat. It took everything in her to hold back the rush of tears threatening to spill over. She felt as though her heart had been ripped out of her chest. This wasn't discipline, it was humiliation. He was being made a spectacle of, displayed like some kind of warning to the other kids. Janelle's hands shook as she approached him, fury rising within her with every step. "Daniel," she called softly, her voice barely steady. At the sound of her voice, Daniel looked up, his eyes widening with surprise and then shame. "Mama," he whispered, his lower lip trembling. Janelle knelt down beside him, her heart breaking at the sight of his tear-streaked face. She reached out, taking his small hands in hers. "Baby, what's going on here? Why are you sitting by yourself like this?" He glanced away, his cheeks reddening as he muttered, "Miss Franklin. She says I'm too loud. She says I talk too much, so I have to sit here." Janelle's jaw clenched as she fought to keep her voice calm. "And how long has she been making you do this?" "A few days," Daniel replied, looking down at his uneaten lunch. "She says it's so I can learn to behave." Janelle felt a surge of anger so intense that it took every ounce of self-control to keep her from marching down the hallway to confront Miss Franklin right then and there. But before she could say anything, a sharp voice broke through her thoughts. "Mrs. Thompson, what are you doing here?" Janelle turned to see Miss Franklin standing a few feet away, her arms crossed, a look of disapproval etched on her face. The teacher's eyes flicked to Daniel, then back to Janelle, a faint smirk playing at the corners of her mouth. "I'm here to see my son," Janelle replied, standing to her full height and meeting the teacher's gaze. "I'd like to know why he's being isolated like this." Miss Franklin raised an eyebrow, as though surprised that Janelle dared to question her authority. "Your son has been disruptive in class," she said coolly. "He speaks out of turn, distracts other students, and frankly, he needs to learn a bit of self-discipline." Janelle took a step forward, her voice trembling with barely contained anger. "So you think the best way to teach a 6-year-old self-discipline is by humiliating him, by isolating him from his peers, and treating him like a pariah?" Miss Franklin's expression hardened. "Mrs. Thompson, I am doing what is necessary to maintain order in my classroom. Daniel needs to understand that there are consequences for his actions. This method has proven effective in the past." "Effective?" Janelle scoffed, her eyes blazing. "Effective at what? Crushing a child's spirit, making him afraid to come to school. You don't understand Daniel at all. He's bright, he's curious, and he's full of life. He doesn't deserve this treatment." The teacher folded her arms, a thin smile curling on her lips. "Perhaps if you spent more time working with him at home, he wouldn't act out here." Janelle felt a sting of indignation at the implication. She clenched her fists, willing herself to stay calm. "I work 2 jobs to support him," she said quietly, her voice trembling with emotion. "I may not be home as much as I want to be, but I make sure he knows he's loved, and I don't appreciate you trying to insinuate that I'm not doing enough." Miss Franklin's smile faltered slightly, but she quickly recovered. "Well, maybe a bit of tough love is what he needs." Janelle took a step closer, her eyes flashing. "Tough love. Tough love is holding your child accountable in a way that helps them grow. What you're doing is cruel and unnecessary. You're punishing him in a way that isolates him, embarrasses him, and makes him dread coming here. That's not discipline. That's bullying." Miss Franklin pursed her lips, looking visibly uncomfortable for the first time. "I am the teacher here, Mrs. Thompson. I have to make decisions that are in the best interest of my classroom." "And what about Daniel's best interest?" Janelle demanded, her voice rising. "He's a child. He's only 6. He needs guidance, not ridicule. If you think treating him like this is going to help him learn, then you're sorely mistaken." For a moment, they stood there, locked in a silent battle of wills, the other children watching the exchange with wide eyes. Finally, Miss Franklin seemed to relent, if only slightly. "Fine," she said, her tone clipped. "If you think you know better, feel free to speak to the principal. But I assure you, Mrs. Thompson, my methods are supported by the administration." Janelle felt a wave of frustration wash over her. She knew that the school's bureaucracy would likely side with Miss Franklin, seeing her as an experienced teacher with a history of effective discipline. But as she looked down at Daniel, sitting alone in his cardboard cell, she knew that she couldn't back down now. She couldn't allow this woman to strip away her son's joy and confidence. She turned back to Daniel, gently placing a hand on his shoulder. "Get your things, sweetheart," she said softly. "You're coming home with me today." Daniel's face lit up with a mixture of relief and gratitude. He quickly gathered his lunch and stood up, his small hand slipping into hers as they walked toward the door. Janelle turned back one last time to meet Miss Franklin's gaze, her voice filled with a quiet resolve. "This isn't over," she said, her tone firm. "I will make sure that you are held accountable for this, and I'll make sure no other child has to go through what you put Daniel through." Without waiting for a response, Janelle led her son out of the cafeteria, her heart pounding with a mixture of anger and determination. She knew that she was in for a fight, but as she looked down at Daniel's face, she knew she would do whatever it took to protect him. No one was going to make her son feel small. Not now. Not ever. The Fight for Justice story. The morning sun streamed through Janelle's kitchen window as she sat at the table, surrounded by a small mountain of paperwork. She'd spent the previous night researching school policies, reading up on her rights as a parent, and jotting down every detail of the events from the day before. She was ready. Today, she had a meeting with Principal Edwards, and she was going to make sure her voice was heard. Her gaze drifted to the living room, where Daniel sat quietly playing with his building blocks. She could see the shadow of sadness in his eyes, a reminder of the humiliations he had faced. It broke her heart, but it also fueled her resolve. She reached out, ruffling his hair as she passed by. "I'll be back soon, sweetheart. Mrs. Hawkins from next door is going to watch you while I'm at the school, okay?" Daniel looked up at her, giving her a small smile. "Okay, Mama. Be careful." She knelt down, wrapping him in a warm hug. "I'll be more than careful," she whispered, holding him tightly. "I'm doing this for you. I'm going to make sure nobody ever makes you feel like that again." By the time Janelle arrived at the school, her nerves were humming with tension, but she took a steadying breath as she walked through the doors. She reminded herself that this was about Daniel, and that she was his voice, his protector. She would not let him down. Principal Edwards was waiting for her in his office, a tall, thin man with silver hair and a calm, almost dispassionate demeanor. He rose as she entered, extending his hand in greeting. "Mrs. Thompson, thank you for coming in on such short notice," he said, motioning for her to take a seat. Janelle shook his hand, feeling the coolness of his palm, then sat across from him, her posture straight and resolute. "Thank you for seeing me, Principal Edwards. I'm here to discuss Miss Franklin's treatment of my son, Daniel." The principal nodded, folding his hands on the desk. "I understand you're concerned about a disciplinary measure that was applied in the lunchroom yesterday. Miss Franklin informed me that Daniel has been struggling with his behavior in class and that she's been trying various approaches to address it." Janelle's eyes flashed with indignation. Struggling with behavior? He's 6 years old. He's energetic, yes, but he's a child. She didn't try to address it with any compassion or understanding. She isolated him, humiliated him in front of his classmates. "He's not a troublemaker, Principal Edwards. He's a little boy who loves to learn, and now he's terrified to come to school." The principal's expression remained neutral. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm aware that Miss Franklin's methods can sometimes seem strict, but she's a seasoned teacher with many years of experience. She's always operated with the best interests of her students in mind. Discipline is necessary for the classroom environment." Janelle shook her head, feeling the surge of frustration. "This isn't discipline, it's abuse. I watched my son sitting in that makeshift cubicle, completely isolated from his friends, with a detention sign on his table like he was a criminal. That's not discipline. That's public shaming." She slid a folder across the desk, containing notes she had made, the specific details of what she had witnessed, and a printed copy of the school's code of conduct regarding discipline. "According to your own policies, disciplinary actions should be constructive and supportive, not punitive and isolating. I want to know why this happened and what will be done to prevent it from happening again, not just to Daniel, but to any child." Principal Edwards leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "I see you've done your research, Mrs. Thompson. I assure you, we take these concerns seriously. I will speak with Miss Franklin and see if there may be an alternative approach for Daniel. In the meantime, I encourage you to work with her on this matter. She's open to parent involvement." Janelle's frustration boiled over. I tried talking to her, but all I got was condescension. She doesn't care about Daniel. She cares about maintaining control. You can speak to her all you want, but I'm not leaving this office until I have your assurance that my son won't be subjected to this treatment again." The principal's gaze hardened slightly. "Mrs. Thompson, we have policies in place to address such concerns. We are willing to investigate the matter, but understand that these procedures take time. I will also need to speak with other teachers who have observed Daniel's behavior." Janelle took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. "You're welcome to speak with any teacher you like, but I'm not backing down. I want to be kept informed every step of the way. And if I don't see a change, I'll take this further." There was a brief silence as the two of them stared at each other, each unwilling to give an inch. Finally, the principal nodded. "Very well, Mrs. Thompson. We'll review the situation and keep you updated." As she walked back to her car, Janelle felt a sense of both triumph and frustration. She'd made her point, but she wasn't entirely sure it had hit home. She had heard stories before about school administrations that protected their own, and she suspected that might be the case here. But as she drove home, an idea began to take shape in her mind. By the time she arrived back at her apartment, she was more certain of her plan. She pulled out her phone, scrolling through her contacts until she found the number of her friend Lisa, who was also a mother at the school. She quickly sent a text asking if Lisa could meet up later that evening. Lisa responded almost immediately, agreeing to meet at a nearby coffee shop. As Janelle entered the shop a few hours later, she was surprised to find that Lisa had already gathered 2 other mothers from the school. They greeted her warmly, their expressions filled with curiosity and concern. "What's going on, Janelle?" Lisa asked as they took their seats, concern etched on her face. Janelle took a deep breath, recounting everything she had discovered about Miss Franklin's treatment of Daniel, and then she shared her conversation with Principal Edwards. As she spoke, she noticed the other mother's expressions shifting from surprise to anger. "That's awful," Lisa said, shaking her head. "You're not the only one. My son came home crying last week because Miss Franklin scolded him for something he didn't even do. He's been terrified of her ever since." One of the other mothers nodded, looking down at her coffee. "My daughter has told me similar stories. I didn't think too much of it at first, but now, maybe we need to do something about this." Janelle's heart swelled with gratitude. She had come here hoping to rally a bit of support, but she hadn't expected such an outpouring. "I think we need to make our voices heard. If the school won't protect our kids, then we have to. Let's gather other parents, share our stories, and push for a real change." The mothers exchanged determined glances, nodding in agreement. Lisa smiled, placing a reassuring hand on Janelle's shoulder. "We're with you, Janelle. We won't let them get away with this." That night, Janelle returned home feeling more hopeful than she had in weeks. She knew there would be obstacles ahead, but with a community of parents by her side, she was more confident than ever that she could make a difference, not just for Daniel, but for every child who walked through those school doors. Together, they would ensure their children's voices were heard. Together, they would demand justice. The power of a united voice. Story. Janelle spent the next several days reaching out to more parents, listening to their stories, and learning just how deep this issue ran. Every conversation seemed to uncover yet another tale of children who had been mistreated, misunderstood, or unfairly punished by Miss Franklin. Janelle's initial anger turned into something deeper, a fierce resolve to protect not only Daniel, but all the children who had been hurt by an authority figure meant to guide and nurture them. Her living room had become something of a war room, with notes, flyers, and printouts of school policies spread across the table. Late one evening, Lisa came over, carrying a box of donuts and a stack of papers. "Looks like you're ready to go to battle," she said with a smile as she glanced around the room. Janelle gave a small laugh, though there was a hardness to her expression. "I never thought I'd be doing something like this, but here we are. I'm just glad so many parents have come forward. We're in this together." Lisa nodded, dropping her papers onto the table. "Speaking of which, the community center said they'd let us use the meeting room on Thursday. I figured that would be a good place for everyone to gather and discuss next steps. We can't keep meeting in living rooms forever." Janelle smiled, grateful for Lisa's unwavering support. "That's perfect. Let's make sure everyone knows the details. I'll send out emails tonight." On Thursday evening, the community center was buzzing with activity. Parents filed into the meeting room, some looking apprehensive, others visibly angry. Janelle felt a surge of nervousness, but pushed it aside as she stood in front of the crowd. She could see Daniel's face in her mind, and she knew she had to do this, for him, and for all of their children. "Thank you all for coming tonight," she began, her voice steady but impassioned. "I know it isn't easy to be here, but we're all here because we share a common goal. Our children deserve a safe, supportive environment at school. They deserve to be treated with respect, and they deserve teachers who care about them." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Several parents nodded, and Janelle could see the determination in their faces. She knew they were ready to take action. She continued, "We've all seen how Miss Franklin treats our kids, and it's unacceptable. But we can't change anything if we don't speak up. Tonight, I want to hear your stories. I want to put together a case to present to the school board, and I need your help to do it. They need to understand that this isn't an isolated incident. This is a pattern." One by one, parents stood up to share their experiences. As the stories poured out, the air in the room grew heavy with anger, sadness, and a shared sense of resolve. A mother named Carla spoke about how her daughter, Sarah, had been singled out for talking too much and had been forced to sit alone at recess for weeks. Another parent, Tom, described how his son had been labeled a troublemaker simply because he struggled with reading and needed extra help. Janelle listened to each story, her heart breaking for these children. She could feel the weight of their pain and frustration, and she knew they had to channel that into something positive. After the last parent had spoken, Janelle took a deep breath and addressed the group. "Thank you all for sharing your stories. This isn't easy, but it's necessary. I'm compiling all of this information, and I plan to present it to the school board next week. We need to hold them accountable, not just Miss Franklin, but the entire administration. If they've allowed this to continue, they're just as responsible." The parents around her nodded in agreement, some wiping away tears, others clenching their fists in anger. They were ready for this fight. Lisa raised her hand. "Do you think we should bring this to the local news as well? If the school board won't listen, maybe public pressure will make them pay attention." Janelle considered this for a moment. She hadn't thought about going to the media, but Lisa was right. If they could get public support, it would be much harder for the school to brush them off. She nodded. "Yes, let's do it. I'll contact some local reporters tomorrow." The parents left the meeting that night with a renewed sense of purpose. Janelle felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. They were finally making progress, finally taking steps to protect their children. The following week, Janelle and a group of parents, armed with their testimonies and supporting documents, walked into the school board meeting. They had called ahead to schedule a spot on the agenda, and the board members looked somewhat surprised to see such a large group of parents present. As Janelle took the podium, she could feel the weight of the moment. She knew that this was their chance to make a real difference. "Good evening, members of the school board," she began, her voice steady. "My name is Janelle Thompson, and I am here on behalf of a group of concerned parents. We're here to address a very serious issue: the mistreatment of our children by Miss Franklin, a teacher at this school. We have collected numerous accounts from parents detailing incidents of isolation, humiliation, and harsh punishments. This has gone on for far too long, and we are here to demand accountability." She went on to share specific stories, pausing to let the weight of each one sink in. As she spoke, she could see the reactions of the board members, some shifting uncomfortably, others leaning forward with a look of concern. When she finished, there was a heavy silence in the room. Finally, one of the board members, a woman named Ms. Rodriguez, spoke up. "Mrs. Thompson, I want to thank you for bringing this to our attention. We will certainly look into these allegations. However, I must remind you that disciplinary actions within the classroom are generally at the discretion of the teacher." Janelle clenched her fists, trying to keep her temper in check. "We're not here to challenge discipline, Ms. Rodriguez. We're here to challenge abuse. There is a difference, and if the administration doesn't see that, then it's failing our children." Another board member, Mr. Franklin, cleared his throat. "We understand your concerns, Mrs. Thompson, and will begin an internal review. But these things take time. In the meantime, I encourage you to work with the school principal to address any immediate issues." Janelle took a deep breath, feeling the familiar frustration building up. She had expected this. She knew that bureaucracy moved slowly, but she also knew they couldn't afford to wait. "We'll follow up," she said, her voice firm. "But understand this, we're not going away. And if we don't see action, We'll take this to the media. We're prepared to do whatever it takes to protect our children." The board members exchanged glances, clearly taken aback by her determination. She could see the wheels turning in their minds, and she knew they were beginning to realize the seriousness of the situation. As she left the meeting, Janelle felt a strange sense of calm. She had done everything she could, and now it was up to the board to respond. But she knew that if they didn't, she had a community of parents ready to fight alongside her. Together, they were a force to be reckoned with, and they would not rest until their children were safe. The following day, a local news reporter contacted Janelle, asking for an interview. Word had spread quickly about the school board meeting, and the community was buzzing with the news. Janelle agreed, feeling a renewed sense of hope. They were finally being heard. As she sat down for the interview, she thought of Daniel and all the other children who had been affected by Miss Franklin's harsh treatment. She was determined to be their voice, to fight for them until real change happened. And she knew, without a doubt, that she would do whatever it took to protect them. The Community Stand story. The day after Janelle's interview aired, the reaction was swift and powerful. By the time she woke up, her phone was buzzing with messages, some from parents she knew, others from complete strangers. Lisa had called her early, excitedly announcing that the story had already picked up momentum online, sparking countless discussions on social media. Janelle spent that morning sifting through the messages. Some were supportive, sharing words of encouragement and expressing gratitude for speaking up. Other parents shared their own painful stories, not just about Miss Franklin but about similar experiences with other teachers in different schools. However, not all the feedback was positive. Some messages were critical, accusing Janelle and the other parents of overreacting or even attempting to sabotage a teacher's career. Janelle tried not to let the negative comments affect her, but it was difficult. She knew that speaking out often came with backlash, but she hadn't anticipated just how harsh it would be. As she made her way through the messages, she came across one from someone she hadn't heard from in years. Mrs. Thompson, one of her own high school teachers. "Janelle," the message read, "I just saw your story. I'm so proud of you for standing up for your son. It's not easy to speak out, but you're making a difference. Please let me know if there's anything I can do to help." A wave of warmth washed over her, and for the first time that morning, she felt a glimmer of hope. She replied, thanking Mrs. Thompson for her support and explaining how challenging the journey had been. By the time she put her phone down, she felt ready to continue the fight. That afternoon, the school issued a statement. It was brief and carefully worded, acknowledging the parents' concerns and promising a thorough investigation into Miss Franklin's conduct. However, to Janelle, it sounded more like damage control than an authentic commitment to change. Later that day, Janelle met with Lisa and several other parents at the community center. They gathered around a table, their faces a mixture of determination and frustration as they read through the school's statement. Lisa tapped the paper with her finger, her brow furrowed. "This doesn't mean anything," she said, her voice laced with frustration. "They're just trying to keep us quiet. A thorough investigation. How long are they going to drag this out?" Janelle nodded, understanding Lisa's frustration. "I don't trust it either. They're just hoping we'll get tired and give up. But we can't let them win. We need to keep the pressure on." One of the other parents, a man named Victor, spoke up. "I've got a friend who's a journalist. He suggested we start a petition, something we can show to the school board and the community. If we can get enough signatures, it'll show them that this isn't just a few angry parents. It's a community demanding change." Janelle's eyes lit up. "That's a great idea, Victor. Let's do it. I'll start working on it tonight, and we'll get it out to as many people as possible. We need to make it clear that we're not backing down." Over the next few days, the petition gained momentum. Parents, students, and community members signed it in droves, their names filling the pages with a collective voice demanding accountability and reform. Janelle watched as the number of signatures climbed, feeling a renewed sense of purpose with each one. She knew that their movement was growing, that they were no longer just a small group of concerned parents, but a united front. Then, one evening, she received a phone call that would change everything. "Hello, is this Janelle Thompson?" The voice on the other end was soft but firm, carrying a tone of urgency. "Yes, this is Janelle," she replied, unsure of what to expect. "My name is Patricia Edwards," the woman said. "I used to work at Daniel's school. I left last year, but I've seen what you're doing, and I wanted to reach out. I saw firsthand what Miss Franklin did to those children, and I can tell you, it's even worse than you know. I want to help. I'm willing to come forward and testify, if you'll have me." Janelle's heart raced as she processed the woman's words. You saw it too. You mean you saw her mistreating the kids?" "Yes," Patricia replied, her voice trembling slightly. "There were so many times I wanted to speak up, but the administration brushed it off. I was afraid of losing my job, and I regret not doing more. But I want to make it right now. I'll do whatever it takes." Tears pricked at Janelle's eyes as relief washed over her. "Thank you, Patricia. This means so much to us. With your help, I think we can finally make them listen." The following week, Patricia met with Janelle, Lisa, and several other parents at a local cafe. She was a quiet woman with a gentle demeanor and a sincerity that made it clear she was telling the truth. As she recounted her experiences, the parents listened intently, some nodding, others wiping away tears as they heard her describe the ways Miss Franklin had isolated, humiliated, and belittled her students. "I tried to go to the principal multiple times," Patricia explained, her hands twisting in her lap. "But they always told me to mind my own classroom, and that Miss Franklin was a valuable teacher with high standards. They wouldn't listen. I thought maybe I was overreacting, but now, seeing all of you here, I know it wasn't just me." Janelle reached across the table, placing a reassuring hand on Patricia's. "Thank you for coming forward. I know it's not easy, but your testimony could make all the difference. We're going to present this to the school board. And with your help, we'll make sure they can't ignore us." Patricia nodded, a spark of determination in her eyes. "I'm ready. I should have done this a long time ago." Armed with Patricia's testimony and the petition, which had now garnered over 1,000 signatures, Janelle and the group of parents prepared for another meeting with the school board. This time, they were ready. They had evidence, they had witnesses, and they had the support of the community. The meeting room was packed that evening with parents, teachers, and members of the press filling the seats. Janelle felt a sense of pride as she looked around, seeing the faces of people who had come to stand with them. The board members, clearly uneasy, sat at the front of the room, their faces reflecting a mixture of discomfort and apprehension. Janelle stepped up to the podium, her heart pounding but her voice steady. "Good evening," she began, her gaze sweeping over the board members. "We are here tonight to demand change. We have brought with us a petition, signed by over 1,000 members of this community, and we have a witness, someone who has seen firsthand the harm that Miss Franklin has inflicted on our children." She gestured to Patricia, who stood up, her expression calm but resolute. The room was silent as she began to speak, detailing her experiences and describing the ways Miss Franklin had mistreated her students. The board members listened, their expressions growing increasingly serious as they realized the gravity of the situation. When Patricia finished, Janelle took the floor once more. "This is no longer just a matter of discipline. This is a matter of abuse, and we will not stand for it. We demand that you take immediate action to protect our children and ensure that this never happens again." The room erupted in applause as Janelle stepped down, the parents around her offering words of encouragement and support. She felt a sense of relief, knowing that they had done everything they could. The board had no choice but to listen, and she knew that, one way or another, change was coming. As she left the meeting that night, Janelle felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in weeks. She had fought for her son, and for every child who had been mistreated, and she knew that their voices had finally been heard. The road ahead might still be difficult, but she was ready to face it, knowing that she was not alone. A new beginning story. In the days following the board meeting, the school seemed almost transformed overnight. An announcement was made that Miss Franklin had been placed on suspension, pending a thorough investigation into the allegations brought forward. The administration also made a promise to reevaluate the disciplinary practices used at the school and to conduct mandatory sensitivity training for the entire staff. Though it was only the beginning, Janelle felt a profound sense of relief, knowing that something was finally being done. The school principal personally reached out to Janelle, offering both an apology and a meeting to discuss their plans moving forward. As she sat in the principal's office, Janelle noticed a change in the principal's tone. It was no longer dismissive or defensive, but filled with a genuine desire to listen. "We failed your son, Mrs. Thompson," the principal admitted, his voice heavy with remorse. "We failed all of our students by not catching this sooner. We're grateful that you and the other parents brought this to our attention, even if it was difficult." Janelle took a deep breath, letting her frustration and anger dissipate. She knew that forgiveness would come with time, but for now, she wanted assurance that the changes they promised would be carried out. "Thank you for acknowledging that, Principal Green. But words aren't enough. We need to see action, and we need to know that you'll protect every student, not just Daniel. They all deserve to feel safe and respected here." Principal Green nodded, and Janelle felt a sense of cautious optimism. She knew the road ahead would still be challenging, but for the first time, she felt that the school was truly committed to making things right. A week later, it was time for Daniel to return to school. Janelle watched as he sat on the edge of his bed that morning, his small hands fidgeting with the sleeves of his shirt. She sat beside him, wrapping an arm around his shoulders. "How are you feeling, honey?" she asked gently. Daniel looked up at her, a flicker of worry in his eyes. "What if people make fun of me, Mama? What if they think I'm weak because of what happened?" Janelle's heart ached as she looked into his troubled eyes, but she also felt an overwhelming sense of pride. "Listen to me, Daniel. You are one of the bravest kids I know. You went through something no one should have to go through, and you came out stronger. You showed everyone that it's okay to stand up when something's wrong. You're not weak, sweetheart. You're a hero." Daniel smiled faintly, a small glimmer of hope returning to his expression. "Do you think so?" "I know so," she replied, brushing a stray curl from his forehead. "And if anyone says anything mean to you, remember that I'm right here. And so are a lot of other people. We're all behind you." That seemed to comfort him, and together, they walked out to the car. Janelle felt a twinge of anxiety as they approached the school building, but seeing Daniel's small hand grip his backpack strap determinedly, she knew they had made the right choice. As they reached the entrance, Daniel spotted some of his classmates, who waved excitedly. One of his friends, Jake, ran up to him with a huge grin. "Hey, Daniel. We missed you," Jake said, giving him a high five. Daniel's face lit up, and he returned the high five with enthusiasm. Janelle stood back, a tear slipping down her cheek as she watched her son laugh with his friends. She felt an immense sense of gratitude, not just for the moment but for the strength they had found together. As she walked back to her car, she knew this was a new beginning for both of them. In the months that followed, Janelle's life took on a new direction. She became an advocate for children's rights, speaking at local events and sharing her story with other parents who had gone through similar experiences. She found herself surrounded by a community of individuals who wanted to see real change, and together they worked tirelessly to push for better policies not just in Daniel's school, but in others across the district. And with those words, they stepped into their home, leaving the shadows of the past behind them, and looking forward to a future filled with hope, love, and endless possibilities. Janelle also became involved in local school board meetings, using her voice to ensure that parents were included in conversations about school policies and disciplinary practices. She connected with teachers and administrators, building relationships based on mutual respect and a shared goal of fostering a safe and nurturing environment for all students. Through this journey, Janelle found a new purpose. She no longer saw herself solely as Daniel's mother, but as a fierce advocate for the children who needed someone to stand up for them. She knew that not every parent could afford to take on the fight the way she had, and so she used her voice for those who couldn't. As the seasons changed, Daniel continued to thrive. He regained his love for learning, his curiosity returning stronger than ever. With each day, his confidence grew, and he no longer carried the weight of Miss Franklin's harsh treatment. He had friends, he had his mother's unwavering support, and he had a school that was finally taking steps toward positive change. One afternoon, as Janelle picked Daniel up from school, he climbed into the car with a proud grin on his face. "Mama, guess what? We had a new art teacher today, and she said my painting was amazing. She even put it on the wall." Janelle beamed, ruffling his hair. "That's wonderful, Daniel. I'm so proud of you." They drove home, the warm autumn sunlight streaming through the car windows, and Janelle reflected on how far they had come. They had faced unimaginable challenges, but they had emerged stronger, their bond unbreakable. She knew that there would be more struggles in the future, but for now, she cherished this moment, knowing that she had fought for her son, and that together, they had created a safer, brighter future for him, and for all the children who would come after. As they reached home, Daniel looked up at her, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thanks, Mama," he said softly. "Thanks for everything." Janelle hugged him, her heart swelling with love and pride. "Always, baby, I'll always fight for you."